Is this working? And theirs is working, and the lights are up, so we're over the most nervous part. Welcome, everyone. We're very, very happy to see you here and excited about the moment we're celebrating. Very few places and communities like this can celebrate 50 years of good work, looking forward to 50 more. All right? And that work is going to move in three major directions that we hope our speakers tonight will help you enjoy the passion and the opportunity. I just came this morning from a meeting in Washington where the State Department officials were talking to us about our programs for undergraduates this winter and summer. Religious pluralism is high on their docket. I asked specifically, do you think this theme will morph into other things because it's so difficult? And the program officer said no. They're talking about it more and more. So our trainings with young people is one direction we're developing. Our Journal of Ecumenical Studies, which we'll hear a great deal about tonight, will continue, and we have some surprises for you on that point. And you are our third direction, the people of the Dialogue Institute Network, the resources that we have around the globe. And I urge you during the second book signing, there are posters in this little hallway that give you the storyboard story of 9 of our SUSI alums and what they're doing now. One, Yusuf in Cairo, has 15,000 people reading his blog on what he experienced here in the US. These young people are doing amazing things back in their home countries. So they're part of this network and our resource. You are here in Philadelphia and around the United States. Some people have come from very far. You'll meet a couple of them in a little bit. And I have some others to introduce you in the third part of that program. So that's our 3 parts: our trainings and conferences, our journal, and our network of people. And Paul Knitter, Joan Chittister, and I think I'll remember the third, Leonard Swidler, have agreed to meet up again. They've known each other over many long decades, and they have agreed to share this time with us to help discern our directions. What do they need to be? Where are we in the world right now? It's sometimes very discouraging. How do we find the hope? I know of no better way for hope and guidance than to talk to the people who've been there, done that, and are still doing it. So after the conversation with them, they'll be available for more questions and book signings until 9 o'clock, when we all turn into pumpkins according to Temple's rules about this building. All right? So we do have to exit. All doors will exit, unlike entry. So you can go out the side as well as the way you came in, any of you. So let's get started. You ready? We thought it would be fun for you to hear each of our speakers share how they met. Len, would you lead off, please?
Well, as the oldest of the bunch, I may be wrong, but of course I had read about and read things that Joan had written for many years. I think the first time I actually was able to meet her face to face was on an airplane flying back from South Africa when we were coming from the World Parliament of Religions down in Johannesburg. And it was a long flight, and so we had fantastic conversation. Well, we've met several other times since at various other conferences, but that's the beginning. And it's been only great ever since. Now, Paul is even further back, in my recollection.
Being older than Joan.
Right. We won't go there. I met Paul first sitting in the front of the house. Some of you will recognize the name of Rudolf Bultmann in the University of Marburg. This was back in the late 19th century. That's a Freudian slip. I think it was Bernd Jaspert, am I right? Who was house sitting for Rudolf Bultmann and his wife. They were somewhere down on the Riviera, I think, vacationing. South Tyrol, Südtirol, okay. And so I remember going inside the house and having a drink and looking at the desk where Entmythologisierung was written. For those of you who aren't into that, that was a big deal way back when. So that's my initial recollections.
I met Len in the way most of us are meeting one another anymore. I was one of those people who read Len's early article on Jesus in the Gospels with women. And I decided that this man was going to be saved. If I didn't know another one at that time that would make it, of him I was certain. So frankly, the flight back from Johannesburg was a delayed one. It was that moment when you meet someone in your life who's already been a factor, and you say to myself, it's real, it's possible, it's true, and I can do that too. Paul and I, we go back a good amount of time too, as Paul was a founding trustee and I was a founding member of the what we called the Peace Council, and its purpose was to bring together a number of figures that were recognizable figures in multiple traditions, to bring to bear on world issues the common laser beam of the religious traditions around the world. And though no one ever asked me, I myself decided that the worthiness of such a group was actually the confirmation of your own faith. For instance, if you really, really believe, don't just simply play with the chemistry of the idea. If you really believe that there is only one God, can only be one God, then why would you be so surprised that that one God is giving the same message to everybody on the globe? If this is an honest God, then the truth has to be one. And so our coming together in that Peace Council with the intention of bringing a common spiritual voice from around the world out of figures who would be recognized in every single culture and perhaps multiple cultures was in its own way, I think, the living beginning of a night such as this. When you say, can you have the discussion when you've already had the experiences we've had? There can't be any other answer. So I see Paul as a partner in crime. I see him as a saint. I don't know what you think.
That's because of my white suit.
Well, I don't know what more I can add to that, since they've basically stated how we met. But a few details. Len, yes, we met in Marburg. It must have been 1969, 1970. I was working on my doctoral program in Marburg, and indeed it was in Bultmann's house you remember Calvinstrasse 19? He was perhaps one of the most famous theologians, New Testament scholars at the time, and there was always a stream of visitors, especially Americans, who would stand in front of, remember Bultmann's house, and I don't know how it is still in Germany, but at least in Marburg, they have the family name on the garbage can, right in front of the house, and American students would come up and stand in front of the garbage can with Bultmann on it, and Bultmann would just clap his head off. But anyway, it was in that's where I first got to know you. But our acquaintance deepened when in the early, the end of the 70s, 80s, I don't want to pat each other on the back, but I'll do it anyway. But we were kind of among the few loose cannons on the ship of the Roman Catholic Church that were raising questions about should Christianity consider itself the superior religion over all others, and that meant, raising questions about the uniqueness of Jesus. That was a no-no. Well, it's still a no-no. But I think after that, my book, No Other Name, came out, you called me, I remember, and said, thank you. And I felt immediate, I knew who you were, of course, since we had met, but I knew of your work here at the Journal of Ecumenical Studies. And that was just at a time when it was hard to have support, where you could find a colleague who was there, committed both to these new disturbing questions, but also committed to our Catholic tradition. And it really was a support for me. Joan, we met, right, it was through the Peace Council that we met. Of course, I knew you, but it was do you remember, the very first meeting where Kathy and I, my wife Kathy and I, who's here today, met you and spent the days with you, was in Chiapas, Mexico.
Absolutely.
Oh, and that's where I really got to know you and could witness how you and many others embodied what you were just talking about, embodied what difference it can make, what a powerful force it is when you draw not just on religion as a resource for peace, but on multiple religions as a combined resource for peace. And I still remember you standing up. We were meeting with some of the leaders of the indigenous, the peoples there, the Zapatistas, and the revolt. So this was in, 1996, I think, 1996. And when you stood up and spoke from your heart and combined, as you do so beautifully, eloquence and wisdom in inspiring these struggling people, I just said, my God, how wonderful it is to be in the company of interreligious peacemakers. Yeah.
In that context, we'd like each of you to share what drew you into the interreligious context. How did you get started on that particular path?
Well, my response may seem remote to you, but it's real. I take this as probably the formative dimension of my life, of my personal life. My mother was a young Irish Catholic woman who married Daniel Docherty, who died at the age of 23 and left her a 21-year-old widow with a 2.5-year-old baby. She did at that moment what nobody should do, I learned later. I learned the Catholic priest in my parish from the pulpit above my little head. I was in 2nd grade by that time, teaching the people of the parish that if their children should happen to marry, quote, a non-Catholic, they should not attend the service. That would be sinful for them. They were, in essence, being trained to shun anyone who connected with the other. And my mother had married a Presbyterian. In that, frankly, very difficult social situation, I learned two things. One, that that Roman Catholics did not have a monopoly on prejudice. The Protestant family was every bit as upset. The Protestant Presbyterian mother was just beside herself at the thought of a Catholic grandchild and a Catholic daughter-in-law. It was a very frigid experience, actually. On the other hand, I learned that Protestants were good. Now there was the heresy. I saw my father as a very honest man. He didn't go to church, but he owned a small Bible that he got for regular attendance, believe it or not, and he showed it to me regularly, so I would know. He never darkened any church's doorstep, as far as I know. But at the same time, he was invariably honest. And my mother taught me ritual and life forms and womanliness. My mother didn't have the word feminist, but honey, she knew more about it than a lot of them do right now, yet. And her teaching was clear, it was Catholic, it was womanly, it was straight, and it was non-gendered. I could do anything I wanted to do, and there was never any doubt about that. My father taught two things. If you didn't pass a math course, you would be forever doomed. And the second one was honesty. Now, that was my ecumenical framework. I walked into all differences perfectly comfortable at all times and attuned to finding, first of all, in what way we were alike, and secondly, what was the other gift. Now, I couldn't have enunciated that until I began our very consciously articulated work about functioning as an interfaith group in the public arena. Mm-hmm. But the more we met, the deeper down that coal mine I got, and I understood I was made for this. I was born out of this. I was trained in this, and I would never, ever again allow anyone to bring prejudice into my presence. It has served me well, and I wouldn't give it up for the world, and the only problems I ever found with it were in my own church.
I had a background halfway like yours, Joan. I too had an Irish Catholic mother whose name was Duffy. But in her case, she married a Ukrainian Jew. And so I got started, and I grew up as a little boy in a very special place. Some of you can throw some incense in that direction when I mention the name, Green Bay. Right, I mean, I was born with a football in my mouth. What's very interesting to me is that I was born at the beginning, just before the great collapse. I was born in January 29. So I was like Louis XIV, après le déluge, because that November, Black whatever Friday, the collapse of the stock market, the beginning of the Great Depression, we stayed alive by my mother working. She had a beauty shop. My dad, every once in a while, would get a job, if it were possible, with the WPA. Nobody knows what WPA, they think it means Works, yes, right, we poke all along, right. Works Public Association, but never mind. What's interesting to me as I look back on it, I was not particularly conscious that my dad was not Catholic. I mean, we just did our thing. I went to Catholic schools all the time, and with my mom, I would go to Mass in the morning. And on Sundays, my dad would come with us. And when we went to communion, he would still be in the pew. And I asked my mom, how come? I remember that. I don't remember her answer. But then when I was 16, he just became a Catholic all on his own, and he would join us at daily Mass. And it all seemed perfectly normal, proper, and wasn't a big deal for me growing up. And so the whole idea of taking other people straight in terms of religious and ethnic backgrounds, it was just a kind of course to me. It was no big deal, not some kind of, emancipation kind of event. It just was, that's it, that's reality. So when I got into graduate school many, many years later, looking for a doctoral dissertation topic, University of Wisconsin, I came up with something called the Una Sancta movement, a conversation, dialogue between Catholics and Protestants started after World War I in Germany. And again, it all seemed perfectly obvious. I got married that year. We went to Germany, my wife and I. Our oldest daughter was born in Germany, did research there, did a degree in Catholic theology, and it seemed perfectly normal that we should be doing these things together, so that when we came back to the United States in the beginning of 1960, this was when the council was just about to begin. The council, everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Just like when I say the war, everybody knows what that means too. Right, right. Well, Arlene said, hey, Len, we don't have a journal devoted to ecumenical dialogue. Maybe we should start one. And so, as usual, she had some of my best ideas, and so we started the Journal of Ecumenical Studies. That's how we got started.
Yeah, well, my beginnings in developing an interest in interreligious dialogue, religious diversity, were very different. I had nothing about ecumenism in my early years. I was born from two very traditional Catholic parents, mom from Czech background, my dad Polish, grew up in a Catholic neighborhood, and so my first interest in other religions was when I, 8th grade, St. Joseph's Catholic School in Summit, Illinois, I decided I wanted to be a missionary priest. I wanted, my convictions, my Catholic convictions, was that if I loved these people in other religions, I had to go out and bring them to Jesus, because otherwise they were in deep trouble. That was my conviction. And so I went off out of 8th grade. They had minor seminaries in those years, and my resolve was to prepare myself to convert everyone to not just to Jesus, but to Jesus in the Catholic Church. But, and I'll try to keep this short. But in order to convert them, I had to learn something about them, to study these other religions. And this is a very long story, shortened. The more I studied and learned, the more I found myself asking, why do I have to convert them? Yeah. Really, and especially meeting, I mean, it was just, and I was bewildered. And here I was now, in my advanced studies in the seminary, preparing. I was with the Society of the Divine Word Missionaries. And at that moment, stroke of providence, whatever you want to call it, I was sent to Rome for the last 4 years of seminary training in theology at the Gregorian University. I arrived in Rome in September of 1962. 2 weeks after I arrived in Rome, 3 weeks, I was standing in Piazza San Pietro when John the 23rd led 2,000 some Roman Catholic bishops into the Basilica to start the Second Vatican Council. And that was what kind of enabled me now to come to a very different perspective, because lo and behold, our church, not known for its pioneering new ways and new developments and really came up with a document. It was part of the larger body of documents from the Second Vatican Council, but Nostra Aetate, the declaration, what is it? The Declaration of the Church's attitude towards non-Christian religions. And I remember, just a little bit of personal background there, we were seminarians in Rome at the time, and we had 26 missionary bishops from Indonesia, from India, from New Guinea, Japan, living with us to attend the council. But all of the council documents and discussions were in Latin, and most of these bishops, especially the Americans, couldn't read Latin or understand Latin anymore. So they would come home. But
Those from Boston.
yes, good question. Anyway, so they'd come home from the council every day with their homework, all these sub secreto documents, confidential documents, and they couldn't read. So they asked us seminarians, all of our studies at that time at the Gregorian University were in Latin. So we would translate for the bishops, and that was a big part of my theological education. And I can remember where I was standing in the Collegio del Verbo Divino, the house where we were all living, in front of the chapel when Bishop Simon, Dutch bishop from Sambalpur, India, showed me the first draft of Nostra Aetate, in which I heard my church saying, there is goodness and value.
Everything which is true.
Right. And there is truth and goodness in these other religions. This was something new. And not only that, but that we, Christians, Catholics, are called upon to dialogue with other religions. This then was just confirmed. It both helped me respond to the questions I had. We're not out there to simply to convert, but to be converted. That's what dialogue is. We're going to talk more about that. And so I went from there, thanks to the Second Vatican Council, and kind of confirming that this is what we are all called to do, that things developed.
And one of the things that developed was Arlene's idea about this journal that would record some of these stories of people's openings and beginnings to dialogue with those who were different from themselves. And I am going to surprise Nancy here. Is she here? Because I know of some times that people have to leave, we're going to switch the order. And I'm inviting Nancy to come and share where we are with our Journal of Ecumenical Studies 50 years later. And when I was preparing, I knew she would make me pay for this later, but I just need to say that when I started work with Len and Nancy in 2008, I saw one of the most faithful, diligent, persevering colleagueships I had ever seen. And we cannot find words to express how much we owe Nancy Crody for her 41 years of service to this journal.
There is one person who was around even longer than me, though, and I would like to have him stand for just a moment. Paul Moises is our co-editor. A few of us just saw his retirement event at Rosemont College, but we're still hoping he'll stick around for a little bit. Anyway, there are 6 people I would like to ask to stand just briefly. And please remain standing until all 6 of you are up. Jerian Kopf, a professor of religion at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. Alphonse Typen, who teaches the same subject at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. Joe Stautzenberger, where are you? There you are, right up front. Teaches at Holy Family University here in Philadelphia. Julie Sheets, who is this is the Reverend Doctor, the Ecumenical Chaplain at Villanova University nearby. Nicole Malera, the Reverend, who is a pastor up in Souderton in a United Church of Christ congregation, and Ms. Mays. You may sit now. Okay. There is a special reason I asked these 6 to stand before you. In 41 and a half years, actually, who's counting, that I've worked with Len and with the journal, I have rarely been able to pull anything over on him, but I am hoping that I have succeeded in doing that this year. In my hand, I am holding volume 50, number 1 of the journal, the title of which is A Festschrift in honor of Leonard Swidler. There will be copies available out at the table just outside the door after. I did not dare put them out beforehand because I wanted this to be a surprise, and I think I succeeded. There are... I think he's shocked. That's okay, that's okay. There are 24 authors in there. 20 of them are Temple Religion PhDs, including the first 4 of the people I had stand. The other 2 are Temple Religion students. There is one former faculty member, Jerry Sloyan, who many of you will know. These folks all very happily and willingly wrote articles for this Festschrift. There was an online one done about 10 years ago, but we figured it was time to do a real one now. So, as I say, they will be available. Did I hear a wow? Yes. Yeah. I have been sweating bullets that people wouldn't say anything to him. Okay. I think I'm done. That's enough.
We did it. We did it. For
Hey,
someone
if
who
the
likes...
CIA needs to learn how to keep secrets,
We hope you'll share with Len about articles that are in there during our social time after the conversation, but we want to keep going while we have them to talk
That is
to
what I
us.
forgot to say. The 6 who stood are among the authors.
I think mostly all students of mine.
And there is a poster some of you saw out there. We just had fun putting names and places of Len's students since the 60s. And out of a list of over 200, it got late and we stopped at 65 from 20 different countries. So if your name's not up there, just write it on. Okay? And most of the authors in this issue are students. We know that it is important to make sure this journal goes on for the next 50 years. And we are at a time of very planned transition. And I want to introduce you to 3 persons from the University of Pennsylvania Press: Eric and Emily and Paul. Why don't you stand up so they know who you are? All right. The executive committee of the DI with Nancy and these 3 have been meeting over the last year and did effect a contract in February, March, I forget what it was. It kept going on and on. Nancy will continue working as the managing editor for the Journal of Ecumenical Studies for as long as she wishes, is our agreement with Len. And she will be working with these 3 at the University of Pennsylvania Press, who, by this contract, will become the publishers for the Journal of Ecumenical Studies. Yeah. And yes, Temple fans, we did discuss it with Temple Press, but they are not in the same position to do journals as the Penn Press is, and we look forward to continuity and good management. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. In the next portion, you are participants in this dialogue. If you'll look at your program, in your program you will find the 10 principles for doing dialogue that Len wrote. When, Len? About?
I think 83.
Around 1983. Nostra Aetate was in the 60s. As these three became involved with the interreligious movement, it became clear to each of them in different ways that how to deal with the differences matter, even if there is one God. And Len's principles deal with how to do dialogue. And I've asked each of them to think about, they all three use these principles in different ways, came to it in different ways. But what has your experience been once you dived deep into this interreligious movement? What works, what doesn't work in relation to these principles?
Well, let me just make a short comment. Right, I just need to be closer. The first principle is sort of a definition of what I understand to be dialogue. The word dialogue, of course, has been around for a long, long time. But with Vatican II and that period, it takes on this new meaning, especially in the religion field, but it spills far beyond that, so that I and my colleagues have been trying to spread, as it were, the gospel of dialogue far beyond religious matters. But when I think of dialogue in the interreligious and ecumenical field, that first principle is that what dialogue means, that I want to talk with you who think differently from me so I can learn. Now, for the first 250,000 years of human history on this earth, we've been going the other direction. I want to talk to you because you think differently from me, so I can tell you what the truth is that I have. I wouldn't be holding it if it weren't true, dummy, so you should be like me. Well, a epistemological shift has occurred in the last 200 years or so, whereby we realize nobody knows everything about anything. That means no chemist would get up in the morning and say, I know everything about chemistry, I don't need to go to the laboratory anymore. Or no sociologist would get up in the morning and say, well, I know everything about human activity in groups, I don't need to do any more research. If I hired those people, I'd fire them, they were worthless. But here we are in the religion field, which is the most complex of all the disciplines, an explanation of the ultimate meaning of life and how to live accordingly. And we want to make the claim, oh, well, we know everything about religion. My religion is the right one. If you differ from me, you're obviously wrong. Well, that is so clearly mistaken. But that is just an amazing shift that it takes for people to recognize that. It's like, well, you mentioned my article, Jesus Was a Feminist, back in 1971. I didn't do anything. I just looked at the Gospels, asked the question, what does the Gospels have to say Jesus does and says about women? Well, it's all very clear. He, very positive, nothing negative, and he broke all cultural rules. That's what you call a feminist. It was hidden there in plain sight for 2,000 years, and I don't know why, but nobody saw it. I'm not some genius. I just did what an undergraduate would have done when I just picked up those 4 Gospels and took my 3x5 cards and wrote down all the points, and there it was. But people still write me saying, oh my God, it changed my life. Well, that's also true of interreligious dialogue. I mean, it's so obvious. I cannot know everything about any subject, especially about religion, so let's get on with opening ourselves up to others.
Okay.
Well, if the question is, if I understand the question clearly, Rebecca, you're asking us to indicate which of these principles in our own work, as well as others, we might see as the most difficult to achieve. And I may be more concerned about the commitment to the principles than I am to any single principle. Mm-hmm. But my shorthand for principle number 2, my shorthand, when I look at these and I reduce them to my own sense of learning and response to them, is witness. Witness. I witness to Nostra Aetate by making this conversation a conversation of the faith, that the faith itself confronts or presents me with. Now, I no longer see, after the publication of Nostra Aetate and the tea and crumpets meetings of Lutheran and Catholic priests and a few lay people on the side that lasted for 2 or 3 years after the council, I no longer hear this. I no longer, if I ever did hear it, I no longer hear it preached that this is also a dimension of the Vatican Council and our movement as Catholics into the religious world with any authenticity or integrity at all. I'm impressed. I frankly expected half the size of this group, and that was going to be a generous number. I don't know anybody who is gathering officially to move in an official way in any village, small city, let alone the deanery, to discuss with others in the diocese about what our common understanding of one another is achieving spiritually, socially, heart, head, hands, in any way whatsoever. In other words, you are a voice the church needs to hear. The church needs to hear. We need to be calling this back into existence. It says very clearly, it isn't just that I sit down with my Muslim friends or my Muslim acquaintances or my Hindu friends and acquaintances, which I do plenty of. But somehow or other, the telling that I think that the hidden strength of number 2 is where you say, Lynn, and then realize that your responsibility now is to speak to your own community. Who is it? Is it Blaise? Blaise Pascal says, yes, force rules the world, but opinion looses force. Every place on the globe today, one religion is fighting another. We might as well be back in the Middle Ages. We might as well be at the brink of the Crusades. It's that bad. And the religious figures in each of those arenas is fueling this violence, this danger, this oppression, this barbarism. Now, unless we reorganize again, in a way that does more than talk to our Muslim neighbors in the neighborhood, if we don't continue this common witness to the one God in all of us, I don't see what it's about. I mean, the process is terrific. It's a basic communication process. It is, bar none, I don't know what communication scholar, and I consider myself one of those, could seriously criticize about that Decalogue. But at the same time, if, as a matter of fact, we aren't into number 1 and number 2, number 1 says, I'll do this. I will participate in these structures. And number 2 says, and then I'll call the rest of my community to it. I don't know what we do.
Yeah, in pondering which of these 10 principles, they were the dialogue decalogue in their first, or at least that's what you have called it. And I use this frequently, Len, in my courses. Which is the most difficult? Which presents the most problems? Either consciously or subconsciously, either overtly or unawarely. It seems to me it's the one, which one is it, where you quote from Vatican II, dialogue must take place par cum pari, between equals. I don't remember the but now, of course, everybody will say, yeah, of course, yeah, we're all equal. Well, that, I think, is easily stated, but very difficult to really feel. To operate out of the awareness, the consciousness that this Muslim, I'm speaking now as a Christian, that this Muslim or this Buddhist or this Hindu is equal to what I have been given in my religion. And I'm saying this is especially difficult, but not exclusively difficult, for Christians. And that has to do with claims of having the one and only Savior, the final and fullest revelation, the last word. I mean, and so, but then again, this is, Islam talks about Muhammad as the seal of the prophets, the last of the prophets. And you can find, in other words, you'll find in every religious tradition the teaching, sometimes the teaching in very authoritative sacred scriptures, God's revelation, that, to put it into contemporary jargon, my God is bigger than your God. Or I've got the final word. Or we are the truth. Or, to a phrase that has been misused, but it fits here, we are the chosen ones. Mm-hmm. So how to bring our theology, our self-understanding, what we've been taught, how to bring that into balance with our recognition that this dialogue, this conversation isn't going to work unless the playing field is level, unless we are equal. So this, what we say we want to do in dialogue, where a dialogue between equals, doesn't match what is so often the teaching, the theology of our traditions, where we say we are the best. And how to deal with that, I think, is something that comes up frequently in the pages of the Journal of Ecumenical Studies and is being thrown, but it remains to be a problem. And Joan, that's not the reason why there is so much violence in the name of religion today. The fundamental reason, I think, is socioeconomic, political. But when you feel that your religion has been slighted and your religion is the chosen religion, when you feel that they are attacking not just you, but God's revealed truth, oh man, that can really power people to be committed to fighting and doing something about that. And the appeal to violence becomes all the easier when you are resorting to violence. Why? To defend God's final truth.
But wait a minute, Paul. Yeah, I know what you're saying, and I agree with you about the fundamental reason for the violence. Except that I no longer think. I think we're at a very dangerous era. You now have whatever you think of them, and you can argue that it's subconscious. They're an oppressed people, but you still have alive on this globe this afternoon ISIS, who ran the Yazidis into caves in the mountains to purge the religion, to purify the religion. And they when they argue for that caliphate, then I'm presuming that is their reaction to the feeling of rejection by the rest of the globe. And it's not necessarily consciously political or economic. It has something to do with being seen as a people that have been dismissed. And I think there is something in the DNA, in the human mind, that goes back to the expulsion from the West a long time ago. Yep. And that's still an agenda that we're dealing with but don't face. And we don't have, when we talk about pari pari, or pari cum pari, which I think is absolutely fundamental in all dialogue, including marital dialogue. Who has the power? You know, where does this gender balance come? If we do not encourage these traditions themselves to continue in a formal way, if you don't have imams talking to priests, and Hindus talking to Buddhists, and Christians talking to at least one another in a way that is holy and spiritual, I don't know how we get beyond the political economic structures that are oppressing all of us if we know it.
I'd like to add a dimension, a positive dimension here. Maybe this is a reflection of me. I've lived long enough that I see this whole concern for dialogue coming of age. When I think of the beginning of the Jewish-Christian-Muslim dialogue that I helped get started when Sarge Schreiber asked Gene Fisher and me to start by gathering Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars back in 1978, after about 3 years, we got, like 10 Jewish scholars, 10 Muslim, and 10 Christian. We kept meeting every 6 months for several years down in Washington. Then about three years into that, the Muslims began to say to themselves, we need to find more fellow Muslims who are also interested and committed to dialogue. And we non-Muslims, yes, okay, fine, we'll support you. And they looked, and remember, these people, these 10 came from all around the world, like the Jewish ones and the Christian ones. And they looked, and they looked, and they couldn't find any more. They could not find any more. If there were some, they must have been in countries where they didn't feel safe to speak. This is what it was like from 78 until after 9/11. My experience is that the first 5-6 years after 9/11, shock, and then about 2007, the Muslims of the world leadership began to come into the dialogue. The king of Saudi Arabia, the heartland of Wahhabism, went to see, guess who? My old buddy Joe Ratzinger, who is now Pope Ben XVI in Rome, and started a dialogue. We even have professors of Islamics coming from Saud University, Imam University in Riyadh, every few months here at the Dialogue Institute. My God, who would have thunk it? I mean, it seemed absolutely impossible in those days. It has turned around. There are hundreds and hundreds of imams in this country alone who are engaging now in dialogue, whereas before, they would, I was on conversations after the Salman Rushdie affair, like 25, 30 years ago. Oh my God, they were condemnatory. It's a very new scene. Now, my judgment is, this is like a ship which has been going in the wrong direction for decades, for millennia, and we have now turned around and we've gone 10 yards. We've got a hell of a long way to go, but we are going in the right direction.
Maybe that's a good moment to invite your questions. Each of you is here because at some level you share the passion of these three for making peace through dialogue and creating justice. So I invite you. We've had a couple of questions turned in, which I will weave in. But if what you've heard so far this evening, something is coming up for you, please raise your hand and we'll make sure and get a mic to you. The room is fairly good acoustically, so we may not need that.
Rebecca, may I suggest it's always very difficult to get the first question. Let's skip it. Who's got the second question?
How about a show of hands from the people in this room who's ever had a dialogue in their present church?
With someone from another religion.
How many have ever done that in your own church? Hey, you got a few hands, great.
My church did once.
What?
My Catholic parish didn't want to entertain when I offered to talk about something.
Right, okay. But that's not.
That's the work that Len says we still need to do. But other questions? Way in the back. Yes, stand and speak out.
As I was listening to you, I tried to follow what you have done all along the ages and the great unfolding, and I wanted to just express my deep thought, but what came to me was Taylor de Chardin's quote, "A thought properly conceived will come about. It may not be during my lifetime, but it will come about." And I think that is exactly what you have all done over the years. You're helping to bring it to come about. And I am most grateful for all of that. I really am. I just had to thank you for all that.
Paul, I appreciated your reflection on the theological challenge of dialogue between equals, but I found myself wondering about the challenge around all kinds of other dynamics that cause inequity between us. So being of dominant culture, having financial privilege, having privilege as a white person, in the many different, so it's kind of a very broad question, but I'm just wondering how dialogue happens, not only with the theological tension that can be a barrier, but when there are so many other ways that there are inequities in our relationships.
Yeah.
And as you answer that, I do know from having talked with you both that you had a pretty profound disagreement between you two, Len and Paul, over liberation theology. So you might liberation theology, and so you might talk about how you differed and how you respect the difference in the context of Amy's good question.
I'm sure Paul can tell you about how he changed and agreed with me.
There's always hope. No, but that's a very important question. To have a dialogue of equals is not just what I referred to about our viewpoint, our theological, our doctrinal. I mean, can we come to recognize that God, or whatever we call the ultimate reality, is equally available to all of us? I mean, that's one thing. But, and here it does touch on some of the differences we have had in our animated, always friendly past. Some would say, I would say, someone like Gregory Baum would say, that the dialogue among equals is not able to be realized when there is a difference, not just of theologies and attitudes, but in a difference of power. When one participant in the dialogue has power, directly or indirectly, over the other, or has more power than the other. What do I mean by power? I mean wealth. I mean majority, ethnic majority. I mean belonging to part of a military context in which your group, your country, has dominance over the country that the other participant in the dialogue represents. I mean, these when there is an inequality of power, and that means an inequality of financial well-being. So in other words, so you have a dialogue. That's rather abstract, but let's just bring it down concretely. So you call a dialogue together, representatives from Indonesia, representatives from Latin America, representatives from India, and they're all coming together. And who paid for it? Who provided the means for transportation? In which language is it being conducted? Whoever speaks the mother language or the language in which the dialogue is being conducted has an advantage over those who speak, and it's usually English. So in other words, the disparity of power, the disparity of the sharing in the goods of this earth, the disparity, on these multiple levels are going to affect the dynamic and the outcome of the dialogue. So, I mean, these are difficult issues, and I'm not saying that they can just be resolved very easily. Oh, this is the problem, let's solve it. But to be aware, and therefore, some would say the need that it is not sufficient simply to call people together for a dialogue where we can all talk to each other around the same table, but it is also essential to be doing something, to strive for a greater share in the goods of this earth, and to make sure that those people who have paid for the dialogue, who have paid for the table around which people are gathering, are aware of this and are making space for the others in some way. It's a very complex, but it's I think, an essential. So the need for not just dialogue, but efforts, and this comes under the category of liberation theology, trying to bring about a more equitable share and to be aware of how some groups are exploiting others, even when they're not aware of it. That unless we're aware of these issues, even though we can't do anything about them immediately, but at least unless we're aware of these issues, the dialogue may be hobbled.
Sister Joan, I think.
Joan, you want to say?
No.
Well, I was just going to say, of course, total agreement with what you've said. In a certain sense, I would like to broaden it a little bit in the sense that dialogue in the narrower sense, meaning I want to talk with you so I can learn something more about reality. In other words, we're searching for truth together. It seems to me that the dialogue is got to be broader and deeper than that. And so I often speak about the dialogue of the head. That's what we were speaking of here now. But also the dialogue of the hands, where it isn't simply a question, I want to learn the truth from you, and vice versa, but together we want to work for the good, especially in those circumstances where each of us individually cannot do it or cannot do it as effectively as if and when we do it together. That's the kind of dialogue that I think is also desperately necessary. And then the third is what I call the dialogue of the heart. Here, all of the aesthetic dimension, poetry, everything, beauty. Everybody responds to beauty. And we meet the other, who is so alien to us in so many ways, most easily through the arts. That's the easiest door to enter. And then, of course, the other dimension is the interior dimension, the dialogue of the heart that way. And we should not say, oh, do we do either one or other of these dialogues? We need to do all of them because we're humans.
But Len, can I ask? I mean, agreeing.
We probably don't even need the mic.
But agreeing with what you said, these three forms of dialogue, all of them are essential. But would you say, given our world as it is, that one of them may have a certain priority?
Yine. Right. It depends. I mean, this is where we had our conversation back in the 90s, I think it was, when we had this book together with John Cobb and this brilliant woman, Catholic theologian who died. Monica Helwig, right. Anyway, yes. And the priority is, what can I do here and now most effectively, and what, and so it depends on my talents, on where I am, and what the needs are, and what the possibilities are. And so you choose according to those options now, be as effective as possible. To have a concert pianist spend his time doing something in, let's say, economic reflection is not the best use of his or her talents, in my judgment. So it depends on the talents. That's what I would say. And of course, in the end, there's the fourth dimension, the fourth dialogue, namely the dialogue of the one. We as humans have to integrate it together. In myself, I don't exist alone, I exist in community.
Yeah, I know, but There's something missing in this conversation, and I wish I weren't the one again to bring it up, but I'm going to, I'm going to. Look, the closest we have come to the awareness of the underclass in the human race has been liberation theology. I don't know how that can be denied. However, I don't know one liberation theologian who brought women to the table as women. They did nothing to liberate women. It can't be all about money. It is all about power. And what is power? Power is the awareness that what I say I want, I will get. It's that simple. It is not an economic definition under any circumstances. Power is the awareness that what I say I want done will be done. So you have in a minority situation in Ferguson, the power shifted. And it shifted in 48 hours because somehow or other, the people who before that time could give the orders, could say what we want done will be done, and get up in the morning and know it would be done, got told in a million ways, it's not going to be done, we're not doing it anymore. That goes back through race relations all the time. Now, women have begun to claim their power. And what has happened in every single culture is the diminishment. You can't use the F word in public. You know what it is. Yeah. Feminism. You can't stand up with any kind of integrity and say, I am a feminist. Now, I was one of those people at the beginning who knew where the power lay. And I said, well, I'm not a feminist, but. I did that for years. I'm not a feminist, but. Then I saw the quatrain, little poem. It said, Mama, what's a feminist? A feminist, my daughter, is anyone who thinks or cares to take in charge her own affairs as men don't think she ought her. That was Alice Dewey Miller, 1932. That's where I learned about power. So it seems to me that somehow or other, the base of liberation has to lie at the level of the human, not at the level even, though I don't want you to misunderstand, Paul, because I know what you're talking about, and it's real. And on a political and a global level, there is no doubt about it. But it also shows up in religion. And it shows up very clearly in religion. And why does it show up in religion the way it has? Why have even these Christian Protestant women gone so long to have the right to claim the totality of their religion? Because religion defines women as powerless. Religion defines women. Every religion on the globe starts out with woman the underling. But they put them on, you know why they put women on a pedestal? Because if you put women on a pedestal, they're not taking up any of your territory on the earth. You can move them anywhere you want them.
Well, we're done. Do you want to move?
I want to see if there's
You want to
another
rescue
question
me and Paul?
popping up. After that, yes.
No, I just wanted to make a comment. Just that, as you were talking about the unevenness of power, the first thing that came into my mind was Ferguson. And what's happening in Baltimore. And even what's happening in Philadelphia. You know, the great unevenness of power between the black community and the police, not just here, but all over America.
Right. And I was listening on NPR radio just earlier today, coming out of New Mexico. The Hispanics down there are in the similar sort of thing. Up here, us Yankees don't know much about that, but they have the same kind of experience. The
unequalness of power, though, is rooted in economics. I mean, in wealth. Who has the wealth? How the wealth is maintained? How the wealth then has control of the politics? And it's unless we can address the economic political realities, and we're not going to.
I couldn't agree more with that. But who? Let's take your proposition to the base. Who do you think will address them? Do you think women will be addressing them? No. Your unspoken sentence is, unless we who are in power, and that's 98% of the males of the world, and certainly in America yet, unless we men address this, it won't get resolved. Unless we start from the human level, unless we start from any kind of parity of wisdom, intelligence, commitment, and investment, we can never. That young woman brought up a very important element when she said, yeah, intellectual's fine, but what about the rest of them? Lynn came back and he talked about collaboration and culture and
Aesthetics.
what?
Aesthetics.
Aesthetics, yeah. And all of that, you see, implies the human. That you will have to bring in the women artists, and you will have to bring in, you have got to identify women in every group if you're really going to talk about working on the power issue.
Right.
And with that,
I think the name of my church, our church here, Catholicos, Catholic, in the sense of universal, makes a lot of sense. And what I think of as the Catholic tradition, not only intellectually but in general, it's a both and rather than an either or. And so when I mean, that's kind of why I said yine, because we need to, of course the economic is desperately important, but I would also say, of course the spiritual is desperately important. Of course the aesthetic is, of course the intellectual. Each one is, and it's not a question of either or. And it's like one huge circle. As soon as you pull it, you're pulling the whole damn thing. And then where do I start? Right now, this minute, well, that depends on me, my talents, what the circumstances are, and that's the way I look at it. And, you know, that does not, in my judgment, in any way diminish the importance of saying the economic is desperately important. But then how do we change the economic? You got to change heads. I mean, people...
and I'm going to interrupt there because I'm the timekeeper, and move us to some of, pardon?
You have power.
I'm exercising it.
And you need to.
to move us to some interesting closing questions, so we have just enough time to hear from each of you in a kind of wrap-up sort of way. You've answered a couple of the questions that staff and board members brought to this evening, two of them being, what directions should the journal pursue with its research capacities? I think we could name several from what you've just spoken. And a question of how do scholars and activists join hands once that research is done? You've both, all three of you, have done both, scholarship and activism, in a way that models for me what I want to do and start doing more of. So each of us has to start where we are. How do we blend that together? What do you see? What would you tell us at the Dialogue Institute, at our individual gifts, our talents? Where do we apply them for the next 50 years of this interreligious dialogue movement? Where would you tell us to dig deep and go further?
Well, I think you ought to start with his model, and I think that you ought to address that young woman's question in at least one of the journals. In what ways are these 4 dimensions of dialogue alive and well, and moving on every level, meaning starting from the social, cultural, or economic, political, that I don't want to sound as if I'm diminishing.
Right.
I don't diminish it at all, because I see it everywhere I go. For instance, supposedly, I'm supposed to be going to Tehran in June. Now, whether or not that will happen, but the visas are being put through. When we get to Tehran, the whole, and they're at their invitation, their imams asking this group of women to bring a small delegation to talk to them about this perception of power that's in the religion and in ours, and what it means with this Muslim-Christian tension inherited from the past. That will have to be, those kinds of things will have to be addressed, but it has to be addressed from that full human level. I mean, I wouldn't want to see a journal that comes out with 20 subjects and 18 of them are dealt with from the usual male citations by males. I would hope that you would model a dialogue of men and women and on all of these subjects and with one another, because until it's modeled well someplace, it's not going to get picked up anyplace.
Yeah, there's so much that can be said, Rebecca, but I don't know. I think that today, given our context and the context that you described, Joan, in which a world in which religion is being used, and used so facilely to promote tensions and to justify violence and hatred, I don't know, at least in the next 10 years or so, I think the emphasis in the journal, or an emphasis in the journal as well as in the Institute, should be on interreligious peacemaking. Now, that's broad, of course, everybody who's going to disagree with that. But still, just to be conscious of what kind, when religions can agree, when certain, at least a significant number of representatives in each of the religions can agree that what they are doing in the name of Christianity, or what they are doing in the name of Islam, or what they are doing in the name of Judaism, yes, even what they're doing in Sri Lanka, for instance, in the name of Buddhism, this is not our faith. This is not our experience. This is not our tradition. To try to have that as a particular concern. Okay, that's the broad thing. What might be, this is an idea, I was talking about this with my wife on the way here, what might be just one particular way of realizing this. And maybe this is more for the Institute than for the journal. But maybe let me just, this is wild, but that the Institute or these groups like the Institute who are focused on interreligious dialogue and drawing on scholarship to provide something like, this is the image is not appropriate, special forces, interreligious special forces, that you would have a group of scholars and activists from various traditions that are ready to be sent to any areas where there is violence going on and tension, especially if religion is playing a role in the tension, that you would be able to set something like the Peace Council, but more readily available. But that you would be able to send a group of 10 or 12 people who are experts in their tradition, but who also know something about conflict resolution, to send them right to the spot so they could immediately contact churches and synagogues and mosques in the neighborhood, and organize people and bring the parties in tension together. But just to have these particularly trained, they would be both scholars and activists, ready, available to be sent. For instance, what was what we had in Manhattan? You know, in the park. What was it? Park 51. Was that it?
The mosque.
Issue, to be able to send, or to even to Ferguson.
Yeah.
To have some kind of interreligious special forces that would be there to bring an interreligious contribution to conflict resolution.
I love it. Yeah. And that might answer one person who asked you to comment on current persecution of Christians, especially in Egypt, a special force. There are people trying. As we come to a close, I'd like to close with a personal question again.
Do I get to say something about this other question first?
Ooh, is this a moment of power? He's never asked me before.
That was an interpersonal.
Go ahead, Len.
Well, I wanted to pick up on what Joan and Paul said, and in a certain sense, flip it in the other direction a little bit, in that I think interreligious dialogue, or just dialogue in general, in the broad sense, as we talked about it before, meaning the head, hands, heart, and the whole, we need to realize we are in a new age in many ways, and here is not only the symbol, but the reality of it. There are hundreds of thousands, even millions of real people out there who are willing to, or do engage in dialogue, would like to engage in dialogue, but for the most part, they're disparate. This room, every one of you here has a network of your own, or probably networks, several different networks. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to invite every one of you here to write to me saying, yes, I would like to use my network of, and then describe it, or whatever these people are, whatever your club or clubs, and you want to use your network to spread the work of dialogue in this broadest sense, not just of the head, but of the hands and of the heart as well. And then we can make a fantastic difference. If there are 100 people in this room right now, and each of you had 15 people on your network, shoot, that's 1,500 people that I was not able to touch before. Paul wasn't able to, or you weren't able. I mean, it's not just you're connected with me, we are connected with each other. That's what I want to see happen. And I hope everybody in this room will go outside afterwards and say, Jesus, Swidler had a nice idea. I hope somebody does it. No, I hope you all go and say, Swidler had a damn good idea. I'm going to do it.
I know we're a little short on time, but I think I'd still like to ask Sister Joan and Paul to answer this question. What enables you to be deeply Catholic and love, respect the other who is very different? Each of you, I've read in your books, answers that in some fairly, really wonderful ways. Len answers it in his biography, which is for sale in our social time, okay? And so do Sister Joan and Paul in their books, but I would like to just give you a chance here for all of us. How do we be the most particularly who we are and embrace the other who is so different?
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Standing on one foot.
I think, first of all, kind of a general statement, and then I'll personalize it. I mean, I do believe, even though this is not acceptable in many parts of the academy today, in our postmodern academy, I do believe that there is a common source and a common goal to all the religious traditions of the world. Now, that doesn't mean every religion and every aspect of religion is good, but I do believe that the deeper one goes into one's own tradition, into one's own, many of you will have, are acquainted with this image, into one's own religious well, the deeper one goes, the more likely it is, I think it will happen, that you will find at the bottom of your well, beyond comprehension, from the top of the well, a source. Whether you call it God, and I'm very wary of using the word God because of my dialogue and experience and practice of Buddhism. Buddhists don't speak about God, but it is when you're going down to the depths of your own religion, you are going to find a source, a mystery, a reality that you know cannot be confined only to your religion. You found it through your well, but what you find, you know, is like this underground source that feeds all the religious wells. That's my conviction. It was an intellectual conviction when I was younger, and the more I've had the opportunity to go into my own Christian well, as well as to go into a Buddhist well, I find it to be true. But more particularly, speaking now as a Christian, through my dialogue with other religions, and especially with Buddhism, I have been enabled to, and it's not just through Buddhism, but especially through Buddhism, I have come to an understanding of Jesus Christ that I think is very consistent with the tradition, but was not the way Jesus was taught to me, even at the Gregorian University back in the end of the 60s, on the 60s. Namely, that this Jesus, for Christians, clearly defines ultimate reality, which we call God, defines, but does not confine. And that really this Jesus is, I love this expression that I have learned from John Cobb, that Jesus is the way that is open to other ways. The way, the truth, and the life. Jesus, the way that is open to other ways, the truth that embraces and is embraced by other truths, the life that can be lived only together with other lives. So it is because of this understanding of my Christian identity that I cannot be committed to the Christian way unless I am open to. And when I say open, it's not just so that I can teach them, but that's what I can be taught by them. So it is, I think, and the model for this, and I'm talking too long here, the model for this for me is Thomas Merton. Yes. Thomas Merton, you read his 7-Story Mountain, he has some pretty nasty things to say about some of Hinduism and some of the Eastern Asian religions. The more he sank into the well of his Christian identity at Gethsemane, the more he became part of and aware of the mystery of Christ, the more we see how he just automatically, necessarily, almost beyond his control, opened up to Buddhism and to Hinduism and to Sufism. So I think Merton can stand as an example of what it means to be committed to one tradition to such an extent that you know you have to be in touch with, you have to be in communication with. And maybe for some of us, you have to be practicing part of another tradition. It just goes with the territory.
Including the secular.
Yes.
My answer, Paul, you won't be surprised, is not that much different, but I would frame it in 2 ways. First, I have seen impacting and profound holiness everywhere, and I stand in mystical awe of it myself. I count among the saints of my life Hindus I know, Buddhists I know, Muslims I know, Sufi I know, Jews that I know, and I'll bring this full circle in my life. I started with a Presbyterian Protestant father, and that stone thrown into that water has rippled out every moment of my life, everywhere. I never felt the boundaries. I knew I was supposed to be bound, but I couldn't live within those boundaries. And I felt holiness coming at me from every side. And secondly, the second element that I would certify as what puts me here with these 2 men today is precisely that the Jesus story is my story. Nothing else fits. Somehow or other, I was born in that seed grew me, that wheat nourishes me. Lord, to whom should I go? I wouldn't be at home anywhere. This is my home. If the Jesus story is my story, and there is any integrity in me, that is the story of the Jesus who proclaimed to a Samaritan woman that he was Messiah, and who did miracles for a Roman soldier. Now, I have no choice then if I say the Jesus story is my story. It is to follow that Jesus and do likewise, to find in the ultimate other the final revelation of my life, and to do miracles for the same ones that Jesus did miracles for.
May I make one? Thank you.
You're so humble.
I didn't know. Shucks. Let me give one concrete example. Unfortunately, I lost a really wonderful friend this year. We all lost a wonderful friend, Reb Zalman Schachter. Zalman was, well, I met him way back in the early 60s and the hippie days, and I used to refer to him as my hippie Hasid. And he came and taught in the religion department at Temple for a number of years. And we did a seminar jointly together on Jewish-Christian dialogue. And we sat side by side like this in the seminar. And those of you who knew Zalman, not only did he smile, but there was an inner glow that just radiated from his face. Amazing. And he always, like a good rabbi, had all kinds of stories to tell. And one day in the seminar, we were talking, and Zalman was telling some story, and suddenly it hit me. I thought, my God, if Yeshua hadn't been murdered when he was 30, but had lived to be 60, he would have been just like Zalman. And I just uttered an inner, wow. I mean, what a revelation this was. My Yeshua, my Jesus, would have been like Reb Zalman. Nothing more to say.
We're going to transition on that note. It is my deep gratitude to each of you for coming, and a prayer that your aha moments may be plentiful as you go forth from this dialogue. There are more books to sign, there's a little bit of food left, and there are strands of conversation that are very important among you all. I just want to acknowledge, do two acknowledgments as we transition to the people who came the farthest tonight. Would our friends from Indonesia just rise? All right? Bernie. Siti, do you want to just say a word about Gajah Mada and what you're doing there?
Yeah, that
Thank you very much. I think what we are doing is like a legacy from what fathers and sisters doing here, and then can be effective in Indonesia. So we are coming from 3 different universities: the National University Gajah Mada, the largest and also the oldest, and then State Islamic University, also the oldest Islamic University in Indonesia, and Christian Sutawatana Christian University, the finest Christian university in Indonesia also. And we are together from these 3 universities coming from different religious background and also tradition, combining together, forming a consortium, the consortium of Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies.
For religious what? Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies. So you see, the resource people are at work on the ground, and we encourage you to go to our new website, launched this week, where you will find others like these colleagues who are working on the ground, and we appreciate your support, your stories, your good words, and your good money. We wouldn't mind being wealthy and learn to use the power rightly. But I think the last acknowledgement of the evening goes to our 3 wonderful guests, Sister Joan Chittister, Lynn Swidler, Paul Knitter. Thank you. Do continue the conversation.
Can I just say that the harpist is my granddaughter?